Welcome to Page One, the award-winning show for writers with the reader in mind.
That draws the reader along, just like fiction.
Here's your host and producer, Zita Christian.
Hi everyone, welcome to Page One. I'm Zita Christian. My guest is a phenomenal writer. He's a Vietnam vet and is accomplished in many areas. For 20 years, he worked as a reporter at the Hartford Courant, as an editor at the Journal Inquirer, and his writing continues today. He is the author of 3 books, numerous articles, and a very active blog, and this is his 3rd time being on Page One. So, Ron Winter, welcome back.
Thank you, Zita. Happy to be here.
I'm so glad that you could do this. I was thinking back to the first time you were on the show, and that was just after Random House published the first book, Masters of the Art, a fighting Marine's memoir of Vietnam.
Right.
So I think my first thought, because I know what we're going to talk about tonight, is, well, you started off with memoir. You started off true story. And then you went to Granny Snatching, and the subtitle for that one...
How a 92-year-old widow fought the courts and her family.
Yeah, to get her freedom.
To get her freedom.
Yeah, and that one, I'm thinking the whole story about elder abuse, and it was told through a personal story. So again, it's true. You're writing a true story, but now you've turned to fiction. So the new book now is called Hypocrite.
The Hypocrite.
The Hypocrite. So tell me what that one's about.
The Hypocrite is essentially about people trying to work through issues of faith. But it isn't quite that formal. It's a Marine comes back from fighting in Iraq, has to go to work, has to find a job, the economy's horrible, ends up working for a man that under normal circumstances he probably wouldn't have gone to work for. This gentleman proclaims himself to be the ultimate quintessential evangelist. If there's a word about God, he has it, it's his. Don't argue with him, because there is no arguing with him. And these two characters clash almost immediately. They're put into a position where each has to have the other, but neither one will give any ground. And then there is another entire cast of characters just below the two main characters, people of faith, people who question faith, and trying to work through the day-to-day rigors of life, and in the meantime dealing with the hypocrite.
And I read something as I was preparing for the interview that says, and at the end of the story, there really is the question of who is the hypocrite. And I think that leads itself to a much larger theme, and we'll get into that in just a minute. I couldn't help but wondering when you talked about the characters, that the main character, Bruce McAllister, Marine vet, and you're a Marine vet. So let's talk about what's autobiographical and what's maybe inspired by something autobiographical or by somebody you know, because but before, what you had written, these were true stories. It was evident that you were writing about people you know. But in fiction, as a fiction writer myself, I think that we always pull something from ourselves into the story, whether or not we're conscious of it.
We either write things that we see as we see them, or we write things as we would like to see them.
Yes.
And as far as the Bruce McAllister character, who is the Marine vet, obviously I wasn't in Iraq, and he had a different job in the Marines than I had when I was in Vietnam. But there are some similarities. There are questions that you have after you have been in a war. You see things differently. You see humanity differently. And you don't really like people telling you, don't question me. Oh, yes, I will. And I'll question you until I'll drive you right up a wall with my questions, because I've seen things that you haven't. But I've had people who've read the book and know me and know my extended family tell me that in Bruce McAllister, they also see my son.
Oh, interesting.
My grown son, who I take that as a compliment. They say the quick wit, the willingness to stand up, for his beliefs and all. I like that. I like when people told me that. So they say that there's other characters in there that they say they can see resemblance to people around me, but then there's a whole cast of characters that I literally just took out of, not so much out of thin air. Morin Smythe is the villain in this book. And Morin Smythe is a man who was at a long, long line of colonialists to start out, back in the 1600s, at the very beginning of the American colonies. And I even get a little bit of the old conflict between Windsor and Wethersfield in here. A lot of this book is written right around this area. You'll find, if you know Rocky Hill, you will find an awful lot of places you recognize, because Rocky Hill turned out to be a great spot to set a lot of what I did in the book. And I also have this guy going over 400 years. But the way I developed Morin Smythe was by taking a person that I'm related to by marriage, who is one of the best people I know, also a veteran and an Iraq veteran, and writing down all of his very best qualities and then creating a mirror image of them, so that all of it was good on this man became bad on this man. And it worked really well. I mean,
Give me an example.
Love to. He's faithful to his wife. He's kind to his children. He's a quiet evangelist. He is a Christian evangelist. He's a quiet evangelist. He is not bombastic. He's not showy. He puts others ahead of himself. He has humility. None of that exists in Morin Smythe. In fact, Morin Smythe is exactly the opposite. It really was good to have a person in my life that I could look at, that I admired greatly, tremendous respect for him, and say, okay, well, what happens if it's not quite him? What happens if it's the opposite of him? And boy, do you get a villain on a villain. And everybody that's read the book so far is telling me one thing: is they love to hate that villain. They love to hate him. My mother-in-law stayed up till 2 o'clock in the morning one night last week reading this book, and she called my wife to tell her, can't we just get rid of him somehow?
That's a good story.
Oh yeah, so that's where they came from. There's a lot of things that I wrote that as I see it, I was saying earlier that a colleague once told me we write best about what we know the most about, and so I think to do my best writing, I have to use some autobiographical elements. That's why I chose the Marine Corps as opposed to the Army or the Navy for Bruce McAllister's service, simply because I just don't know that much about them. I can understand nuances about the Marine Corps because I lived them.
Right.
So I would be just like any other outsider trying to write about something that happened in the Army, because I don't know it really. I would be going on second or third hand information as opposed to first hand.
Because to say military is really too general when you're getting into story.
It sure is.
Because readers want the details.
Oh yeah, and I will tell you right now, there's a cover on Masters of the Art that Random House originally was going to release with a different helicopter on there, and they actually had it on the internet, and a friend of mine saw it and sent me a blistering email that, if you're going to write a nonfiction book about Vietnam, how could you possibly have that on there? That's wrong. And I had already contacted at Random House and said, guys, you can't run with that helicopter, it's all wrong. But there were guys that would just felt, oh well, we need a helicopter, put a helicopter up.
Yes.
Well, not just any helicopter.
No.
You have to have, if you're dealing with a military audience, you believe they will look and they will know.
It's not just a military audience.
Well,
I'll tell you that even in the Regency period, in novels set in Regency England, the tiniest little thing, the word usage or the length of gloves or any number of little things.
Genre fans know what they like and why they like it, and don't deviate. They'll let you know in a heartbeat.
There's a book that I'm reading now called Wired for Story. It's by Lisa Cron. It's a how-to book, for writing fiction. And she says that on some very deep level, we read fiction because we're looking for some clue, some tool about some element of survival. And I was intrigued by the concept, and I started reading her book, and I agree with her. Can you relate anything like that to your book?
In The Hypocrite especially, it truly is about survival. It's about surviving in a war. It's about surviving in a bad economy. It's about trying to find your own spirituality. What does that mean? Are we all alone in this universe, or is there more? If there is more, is it the way it was described thousands of years ago, or are we learning as humans to expand our knowledge? We know far more about the universe than our ancestor did, and maybe we can see that it's a little different than what they could see. I mean, a long time ago they thought that the Earth and the Sun had different positions in the universe. They thought it was flat. Well, it's not. So does that mean you don't have any spirituality because you've learned more? I don't think so. People that really know more about the universe tend to get more spiritual.
Yeah.
I like to tell a story. There was a back in the late 60s, early 70s, after we had started making moon landings, there was an outspoken, I guess, evangelist Christian that worked for NASA. And at that time, prior to going up above the clouds and everything, everyone said God set up above the clouds, and everybody was up there with wings and halos and harps. And once we broke through and went to the moon, they said, well, now has that changed your belief in God, weakened your faith? And he goes, not at all. He said it strengthened it, because he was able to see so much more and to put it into much larger context than what the ancients could do. And that's, when you go back to the whole point of survival, we have to survive physically, but we also have to survive spiritually.
Yeah, we do.
And we do.
And I think more and more that people are not just curious, but willing to look, eager to look. That people want information.
They do.
Yeah. So themes in your story. There's some really, really big ones. I was reading through and I thought, well, first, because of the occupation that you have of your two main characters, one who writes copy, advertising copy, and the other is an evangelist. And I thought, well, both are involved in presenting a story a certain way, maybe persuading someone to buy something, to try something, to join something, to believe something. So there is that element of fact versus fantasy, or how things are presented. And then you've also got something you were just talking about, the idea of religion with its dogma versus spirituality, which I think of as a personal search for what gives meaning to life. So that's a big a part of the book as well. And then the whole question of what does it mean to be a hypocrite. Well,
see, now you have to read the entire book and get to the end of it to see my ideas.
I do, and yes, and I can't wait to do that. But talk to me a little bit about that, because those are big themes.
Let's jump back a little bit. I had actually intended to write The Hypocrite as my next book after Masters of the Art came out. In fact, I wrote what I thought was the last chapter of The Hypocrite in 2007. I had the title in 2007. What happened, though, was in 2008, as we discussed the last time I was here, my mom moved over here, and we were immediately thrown into this horrible battle with my siblings and some of the extended family members who were trying to put my mom into an Alzheimer's home when she didn't have Alzheimer's, didn't want to go. Mom lived, she was 91 when she got here. She lived till she was 95 years, 1 month, and 1 day. We stood side by side and fought shoulder to shoulder with her that whole time. They never let up. They made her go back to New York, to Albany, New York, and stand trial in Supreme Court in Albany back in 2009. She won the day huge. She debated their lawyer and beat his butt. I mean, she put on such a great show, and she had 3 great years that she would not have had if they had been able to force her into an Alzheimer's home back in 2008. But because Mom got here, and because of all this stuff, I shelved The Hypocrite for that time. But because of everything that happened in those 3 years, I believe The Hypocrite is a far better book. Because not only did I see the hypocrisy of people who go to church every Sunday and are very pious and are very open about letting you know that they go to church every Sunday, and they can tell you about the scripture and they can tell you this and that, but their actions are horrendous. And that right there, I had living hypocrites. As much as for granny snatching, I had a living, real situation going on, which it was just like Masters of the Art. There's no sense writing fiction when the truth is stranger and wilder and better. But I was able to look at people around me saying that they were pious people and acting so differently. And then toward the end of Mom's life, we really needed some help. She died on Super Bowl Sunday, February 5th in 2012. She died during the third period. I like to tell people her final words were, "Go Giants." She feared like nothing else dying in a nursing home with machines and tubes and doctors and nurses and no one around her. She died in her own bed at home. The last sound she heard was my daughter playing the piano.
Oh, Ron. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I don't usually get choked up about that, but it just kind of hit me when I was listening, you know. The dogs were with her. They barked a little bit. She was going quiet. The people from hospice, Vita's hospice organization that came and helped us were so good. They were so supportive. And they told Jennifer, my wife Jennifer, who worked so hard to take care of Mom, they told her that she died remarkably pain-free and stress-free. And I'll tell you right now, if you want to, if you know, when we look down that road, I'd prefer to go that way than to have a whole bunch of drugs in me and all. But there gave me the reason to write about a congregation of people who do the right thing every day of their life. One, because it's what they believe in, and two, because it's the right thing to do. And I was able to make the Hypocrite when all was said and done. All the arrangements were over, everything was taken care of. I sat down and started to write the Hypocrite, and I had a whole new vision on it. I had more people to put in it, more situations, and it really, like I said earlier, it's not about going to church. That's not it at all. In fact, I don't think I have a single church scene in the whole book. What I do have in the book is I have deceit and larceny and manipulation and spousal abuse and misogyny, gunfire, car chases, murder, everything you could ask for in a book on religion. And it's all there. And it really, I believe that I've done a good job, and people that have read the book have responded that, of outlining the struggles people of faith see as they go through life. And you only have to look at the news to see how much is going on in the world that is conflicts, external conflicts with religion, and then you look a little more closely and you see all these internal conflicts going on at the same time. And basically that's what I tried to mirror in The Hypocrite. I took it over several centuries, primarily because I started out in one century, then we leapfrogged up. I don't spend an awful lot of time in the 18th century. But anyway, the point being that my belief, you asked about the autobiographical part, my belief, it kind of goes back to the Greek saying that the wheels of the gods grind slow, but they grind exceedingly fine. You will find out that there is payback in this book, and it doesn't happen. We don't get instant gratification. We don't have lightning bolts come flying out of the clouds, you know, and striking people down. But things do happen, and it is with a purpose. It's just not necessarily with our purpose. And I think if we take a look at, I think any person of faith, any person who has no faith, reads The Hypocrite and sits down and thinks about it honestly. One of the points I make in the book, you say, who's the hypocrite? Well, there's a little hypocrite in all of us. And we have to understand that about ourselves because we're humans. You know, we tend to make mistakes and we tend to be human. But in the long run, I believe there's something more, and that's what I tried to convey with the book. That, you know, the best thing you got to do is stick to your beliefs and do what's right. Not because you're waiting, you know, somebody's looking over your shoulder and going to whack you, but you're doing what's right because it's the right thing to do.
But your approach to a whole group of people in the book, it sounds like it was, I'm not going to say dramatically changed, but certainly deepened, enriched.
Yes.
Because of the experience with your mom.
Yep. Yeah. I was able to see, you know, my previous experiences with death were with elderly relatives dying that you knew were going to die, and in Vietnam. My younger brother dying tragically in 1973 in a car accident when he was a high school kid. But never did I see a person die naturally. In my own home, day by day, week by week, seeing all the changes that happen to the human spirit and the human body. You know what doesn't die? That spirit. Wow. I mean, to the very end. That spirit was there. My mother was even joking, you know, within just a matter of days. But she also told me she was ready.
Do you think that she And I know I've talked with some people when they've been with someone who has died, and there's that feeling that there's a message, or that I know when I hear a certain song, I'll think of that person, or if I see a butterfly or a dragonfly or something like that. I know that there was an experience, not that, but something similar, where you felt that there was a message.
Yeah, after Mom died, when I gathered her belongings to put together a memorial service for her. And among her belongings was a Bible that she carried her entire life. It's almost 100 years old. And on the flyleaf of the Bible was a very short inscription, "To Ella, love mother, Mizpah," M-I-Z-P-A-H. Well, I had no idea what that was. Now, in that Bible, there were things that dated it, beside the fact that it was just an ancient Bible. There were locks of my mother's hair when she was 6 months old, and another when she was 18 months old. So we know that inscription, and she'd carry it with, and she'd told me that was a gift to her from her mother many, many, many years ago. We dated that inscription somewhere around 1918. I didn't know what Mizpah meant, so I looked it up. And it turns out that it was in the Old Testament, in Genesis, and Jacob, who was fraternal twins with Esau, had tried to cheat his fraternal twin brother out of his brother's inheritance. He got caught, and he took off and went and lived with his uncle Laban, and it turned out he ended up living with his uncle for 20 years. Married 2 of his daughters, helped make his uncle a very rich man. After 20 years, he decided he wanted to go back to the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel. But he didn't tell his uncle he was leaving. So he took off with his wives and his flocks, and he headed back to Israel. And his uncle found out and went after him, and he finally caught up with him. And he said, why'd you leave without telling me? And he said, well, I thought if I told you, you wouldn't let me go. And his uncle said, no, if you'd told me, I would have done a proper send-off for you. You had the right to go home. So they settled their differences, and they made a pact, and they agreed that they would forever watch out for each other. They would watch each other's backs, they would stand guard for each other, and they built a monument out of stone, and they called it Mizpah. Now, here's the important thing about it. In the centuries since then, in the millennia since then, Mizpah has come to stand for standing guard for your loved ones, standing watch over your loved ones, providing sanctuary, providing refuge. They built this monument just outside the Israeli town of Hebron in a little rocky, hilly area called Gilead. And I live just outside the center of Hebron in a rocky, hilly part of that town called Gilead. And when I saw that, my mouth dropped open, and I was just totally in shock, because my grandmother wrote that in that Bible almost 100 years ago. There's no way she could have known what would befall my mother, who at that time was an infant. All those many, many years later, 9 decades later, she referred back to something that happened 3,000 years ago, and yet it came all the way forward to my home. Yeah, and I'm like, whoa. So that in itself was one of the things that prompted me, really got me going on writing The Hypocrite, because there's a connection between granny snatching and The Hypocrite. Yeah. I want people to know about The Hypocrite because I had experiences taking care of my mother that gave me some insight and made it a better book, made me a better writer. But I also want to talk about The Hypocrite because I want to tell them about Mizpah. I mean, that's not, I find that, I don't think it's miraculous, but I think it's profound that this happened all these centuries and millennia ago. And here, my grandmother writes that maybe around 1918, and then in 2008 to 2012, we are doing this. We have this pact. I'm watching out over my mother and providing, sanctuary and refuge. Where? Just outside the center of Hebron, in a place called Gilead. Yeah. Whoa. This is not small stuff.
No, it's not. It's not small at all. And I think that it kind of gives you shivers, as a writer, and suddenly you realize.
At her memorial service, I told people about it. I almost couldn't get it out. Yeah. Because we had the memorial service in Hebron, and people, when I told people from the audience who came from other towns where the monument was, there was just this gasp, like, oh. Whoa,
like we're all part of a web.
Something larger.
We are.
Something
we definitely
much larger,
are.
Yes.
There was a review of Masters of the Art. I'm sidetracking a minute now, going back to the year 2004, and this was by Philip Kennicott. It was in the Washington Post, and he said, Winter is articulate and a little detached. And then he quotes you saying, I've studied the war extensively in the years since because I did want to know what did it all mean, he says, but his detachment isn't absolute. He never saw most of the people he shot with a .50 caliber machine gun that, quote, spoke with tremendous authority, end quote. But one day, one of the enemy was dragged into his helicopter. The young soldier had pictures of his home and girlfriend among his effects, and the glimpse into the boy's humanity had a strong effect on Winter. That's the piece I pulled from that review. And I thought, I love to, when I talk with writers, I love to think about the writer's thumbprint. What is it that someone could read a story and go, that's a Ron Winter book? And I think when I look at yours, and I'm going to ask you what you think your thumbprint is, but I look at that and I think you approach all your characters, whether you are writing the true story of someone, you know, or of yourself, but also the fictional characters, you approach through humanity.
That's exactly it. And you'll find that in McAllister, but you'll also find it in other characters. Derek Simpson, who is in the book The Hypocrite, is the senior elder of the church. You will find a man of tremendous strength. And that's what maybe this is biological, maybe this is old school, but if I'm going to write about a male character that's a hero, I want him to be strong.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that he can't be vulnerable, but I want him to be strong, and I want him to step up and do his job. Doesn't mean that behind the scenes there isn't a heart. It just means he understands his place and what he has to do and how he has to do it. And it's never easy. It's not that you just walk into these things and brush off life as if it's just a passing fancy. They have to deal with real struggles, real issues, and it does matter to them. But the core of that character will be the strength to do what has to be done, even though there might be supreme challenges attached to it.
You know, we have just a little over a minute left, and I have two things I want to ask you. What's next? Is there a project next?
Yes, there's actually going to be a sequel to The Hypocrite, and I have a name to it, and I'm not going to tell anybody what it is because we don't do that. But
not yet.
I am asked a lot of times, why don't I put more sex? My mother asked me why I didn't have more sex in Masters of the Art. And so there's some sex in the Hypocrite, but because it's illicit sex, I tried to write the funniest sex scene I've ever written, and people tell me I did a good job. But my next book is going to be loaded with sex. I'm going to put so much sex in that book, people. I want people reading that book. I want ladies reading that book, at 11 o'clock at night, closing it, putting it over on the nightstand, and tapping their partner on the shoulder and going, roll over, honey. The people want sex, by God, I'm going to give them sex.
Good. Well, you'll have to come back on the show.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. That's going to be that's going to be a very good show. In 30 seconds, can you tell me, do you feel the emotion that you're writing about when you're writing it?
Yes. And I feel that when I do, I write better. If I let my emotions go. Now, I have to really seal myself off. I'm not a public person with my emotions. It's very difficult for me to really go that way. But I do have them. I just prefer to keep that part of me inside. And if it's coming out while I'm writing, I prefer that I'm alone and don't interrupt me. Okay. The door to my office gets closed and it stays closed until I'm done, and then I say, okay, but then I get told, wow, you nailed it. If I write the most honest emotions I have, you get my best writing.
Well, and you have given us 3 examples of best writing in book form, and I'm absolutely thrilled. Ron, thanks for being on the show tonight. I also want to thank my Page One crew, and I want to thank all of you in the viewing audience. I love to close this show with the words of the fantasy writer Ursula Le Guin, who said, there have been civilizations that did not use the wheel, but there have been no civilizations that did not tell stories. So find your story, find a way to tell it, and do join us again next time. Thank you.
Food for the crew and guests is provided by Manchester Grill of Manchester, Connecticut, and Angelo's Restaurant of Glastonbury, Connecticut. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email Zita at zitatv.com or write to Zita Christian, Page One TV, P.O. Box 1515, Manchester, Connecticut 06045-1515. You can watch this and other episodes of Page One on youtube.com/Zita3x3.